issues, right, pertaining to the African and the African diaspora experience. So because of my own interest in understanding, my ancestors' experience, I selected Howard University based upon the fact that Howard University history department is molded in this particular mindset. So I completed a doctoral dissertation that examines marronage in Jamaica. And my work was completed under the advice of Dr. Selwyn Carrington. He writes on economic history in the Caribbean. My work didn't necessarily cover the economic aspect. I was more interested in the social aspect surrounding Maroons. Now, if you are familiar with the history of enslavement, you will know one of the key things relating to enslavement is that you had resistance. And enslaved Africans and captive Africans who escaped from the plantations and formed communities in the hinterlands, they were referred to as Maroons by the white society at large. So you had Maroons all over, right across the Atlantic world in the Americas. You had Maroon communities in the Dismal Swamps between Virginia and the North Carolina space. You had Maroons in Florida. You had Maroons in Louisiana. You had Maroon communities in Brazil. You had Maroon communities in Cuba. You had Maroon communities in Jamaica, Haiti. Any large plantation society, you usually had what they would term inland Maroon communities. So I was interested and fascinated with this question of marronage. Now, where it relates to the Jamaican space, and you find some similarities with Suriname in South America, where it relates to the Jamaican space is that you can, and I argue that the Maroon history needs to be reassessed, because largely marronage in Jamaica or Maroons in Jamaica are the definition of Maroon is given to those communities that signed treaties with the British in 1739 and 1740. But I argue that once they signed the treaty, the concept of being Maroon, they lost it. They now became a part of the state apparatus. So my work is entitled Post-Treaty Marronage. So I looked at enslaved Africans that escaped from the plantation following the treaties. And in looking at that discussion, I identified a number of sites on the island where enslaved Africans established inland bases. This is outside of the established groups that had received treaties. My work, in addition to looking at what the towns that they established, I looked at the opposition they faced from the state. So the communities that had signed the treaties in 1739 and 1740, one of the requirements is that they were required to assist the state in campaigns against any type of outside or inside insurrection. So the post-treaty Maroons were located or defined as being as aggressive, hence the post-treaty Maroon towns often formed the militia that went in to sack and disperse these post-treaty Maroon towns. But in addition to looking at the phenomena of inland Maroon communities, my work also developed the concept of maritime marronage. There's a historian, Nathaniel Hall. He does a lot of work. Well, he passed away in the 80s something. He did a lot of work on Maroons in the Danish Virgin Islands. And one of the things that he looked at was this concept of maritime marronage, where enslaved Africans in those societies constructed canoes, or they stole boats, or they hid as stowaways on naval vessels and other types of ships, and they would leave the island. Some of them head to Puerto Rico and so forth. So I looked at this question of maritime marronage in relationship to the island of Jamaica. And the question of maritime marronage allowed the dissertation I wrote to discuss different streams of maritime marronage. You had those maritime Maroons that carved canoes or stole boats, and in the first period before Haiti's liberation in 1804, most of them were fleeing to Cuba. And the history interrelates. So you'll find, for example, when you had the Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina, a lot of the Angolans that had participated in that rebellion, they were heading to Florida. Florida at that time, and forgive me because I don't really have all the dates in front of me, but you can look up on your Google the year. At that time, Florida was underneath the Spanish, and the Spanish had this sort of policy, right, where any enslaved person fleeing from British territories, they would receive and be recognized as free people. So Cuba was the closest Spanish destination to the island of Jamaica, and so a lot of enslaved Africans, when they left, right, they headed to Cuba. After 1804, the Haitian Constitution, the first Haitian Constitution, had within it a clause that stated anyone fitting our description, meaning being black, would be considered one of us. So you found after 1804, there was a significant number of enslaved Africans who escaped and fled the island, heading to Haiti after 1804. The other type of maritime marronage I looked at was the issue of stowaway on board vessels. Now, Jamaica, during this time period, in the 19th century, early 19th century, late 18th century, after the American Revolution, right, and also following the War of 1812, what you find in the Jamaican population is that there were a number of enslaved persons from the United States, right, that were settled in Jamaica, but also in other Caribbean islands as well, right? And you had also had a number of these enslaved Afro-Americans stating that they were free. So you have another type of stowaway marronage that I look at. I look at the Afro-Americans that were fleeing Jamaica aboard stowaway ships, wanting and heading back, trying to get to New York, trying to get to Virginia. So there are all of these discussions in the literature where I talk about the stowaway marronage. So these are the different streams that I look at within my work. Following the work I've done at Howard University, the publications that I have pursued and I'm continuing to pursue, they're largely journal articles. I'm going to go into the direction of writing books shortly. I just want to get about 2 more articles out, and then I'll divert my attention to trying to develop book proposals and da 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 da. So I focus a lot on journal articles as it stands right now because I just want to sort of saturate. I think Dr. Luckett explained the importance of trying to just get your name out there, and articles sometimes is an easy way to do it. But given to how the market is sort of clogged, articles sometimes takes about a year to get approved unless you find journals that have a quick turnover rate. But anyway, the journals that I've published, they continue along the lines of looking at resistance. I'm not only interested in marronage, but I'm also interested in the types of tools or strategies that enslaved Africans use to resist. And in Jamaica, one of those strategies or tools is obia. Obia is a system very similar to root work in the southern United States that centers on knowledge of bush, various types of plants, types of insects, where you combine these various natural ingredients with hopes of influencing the material world. So I look at obia in a number of my publications. I have recently, my recent publication looks at obia workers. It came out with the Journal of Pan-African, Journal of, oh, I forgot the title, it's out there on the wall. Sometimes my memory, but it's on the wall. If I go there, you'll see it. I think it is, I don't want you to quote me incorrectly. I don't remember the journal, I can't believe it. And it just came out in August. I can't remember the title of the journal, but it's on the wall, you'll see it over there. It's my recent publication looking at obia across time and space, because one of the things is that obia, because of how it was used against the system, was outlawed, right? And it was outlawed within legal codes by the 1760s, is when you begin to see the first laws banning obia in Jamaica. And there was a fear. I mean, the planters could not, slave owners or the planters could not prove whether or not obia could work, but what they recognized was obia's ability to organize, right? Enslaved people's ability to organize through obia, right? Meaning that before every rebellion would take place, they would have a series of rituals centering around oaths, right? So they would drink rum and gunpowder, would be one of the oaths. They would take various herbal baths, right? They would perform divination. All of these rites or rituals, you'll find them being discussed in the records. And one particular obia man that I look at in this journal article that I just published is Guinea Jack, right? And Guinea Jack, the slave trials on the concerning Guinea Jack. Right, it's the box in the rebellion that I'm talking about with Guinea Jack. That is 1823. And the slave trials are taking place in 1824. And Guinea Jack now, he's African born. He has a lot of similarities to Gullah Jack in the Denmark-Vesey rebellion. And the slave trials, when you look inside of the slave trials on Guinea Jack, you are able to reconstruct the tools that Guinea Jack used right, in his spiritual work, right? So he used a mirror, right? He used different types of herbs like sagebush to protect the participants. He sacrificed a fowl. So one of the things I do with my work is that I always, when I'm examining phenomena like obia, that is an African transferred practice to the Caribbean, is that I always combine investigations in West Africa. So I move in terms of my research also into West and Central Africa, because one of my biggest discussions as a graduate student is that it's impossible when you're talking about enslaved and captive people in the Caribbean or in America for you not to study Africa, because you have to look at the West and Central African homelands of the captives. So for example, where the documents mention Guinea Jack using a mirror, right? The problem that a lot of historians often face is that when they do not incorporate a holistic view, is that they would just mention what he has, but they would not really understand unless they have the background information about this particular captive as to what exactly he uses glass for. So when I conduct ethnographic work, because I have my undergraduate minor is in anthropology, so when I conduct ethnographic and oral history work in West Africa, I go to quite a few of the shrines, and they use divination, they use mirrors as part of their divination activities, right? So I was able, when you read the documents now, there's a certain lens you can read the documents when you're looking at enslaved people, right? And you're looking at their cultural practices that are being mentioned. Because remember, all of these court trials, the planted documents, all of these are white sources. They are sources that belong to the authorities. So they're not really per se, unless there's a few like Hans Sloane that are fascinated with African culture. But when you begin to look at some of these legal documents, they just want to acquire and amass evidence to try them and convict them. They're not interested in their cultural background. But inadvertently, in documenting it, they leave a rich source material that if you have other types of information to read the description, then you can begin to reconstruct the cultural identity of these Africans on the plantation. So with this particular paper, I use my research, right, because I have over 13 years of going into Ghana, West Africa, 2 months at a time, doing field work, and I'm able to use the research, not only in my dissertation, but post-dissertation in my articles, to explain African culture as it is being expressed in people like Guinea Jack. So what I'm trying to get at is that as a historian, you realize that it is not good enough to be specific to one area, right? The Jamaican space, right, is very much international. During the enslaved period, you have Afro-Americans that are on the plantation. You have enslaved Africans coming from various West and Central African groups, to Chambers.
Americans on Jamaican plantations?
Yeah, man.
Americans?
Yeah, because after the war, right, as I mentioned, a lot of when the British left, they carried with them their property, which included enslaved people. They also kidnapped quite a few number of free blacks, and some of them were settled as enslaved people in Jamaica, right? Bahamas, Trinidad, right across. But then you also have free African American communities as well that were established during this period as well on these various islands. So it's a very interesting period. So that what I'm saying to you is that you realize that a particular society, right, during this period of enslavement is very much an international space, and oftentimes when you are analyzing the area, you have to have a sort of international view when you're reading the history, right? So you'll find that equally as well when you look at places like South Carolina, right, which in the early period was settled with enslaved people from Barbados. You find transnational history at work. One of the persons that were responsible for establishing, I think it's the University of Virginia, one of those big universities in Virginia, he was a son of a slave owner in Jamaica that owned a plantation in the parish of St. Thomas, right? When you go up to Long Island in New York and you look at some of those manors, right? A lot of them own plantations in Antigua and other Caribbean islands. When you go up to Rhode Island and you look at people like shipbuilders or traders like Moses Brown, right? They were heavily invested with the slave trade into the Caribbean. So one of the key things is that as a historian, it is important, and you're going to realize that even if you're looking at a particular area, you're going to realize that oftentimes the lines are going to connect you to other geographic spaces. So one of the things that I learned, because before going to graduate school, and even before starting Howard University as an undergraduate, I was always fascinated with people like John Henry Clark and boy, my memory, John Henry Clark. Ooh. I don't know what's happening. Yeah, but John Henry Clark and others, sooner J. Rogers and but John Henry Clark in particular, I was fascinated with his emphasis on knowing world history, right? Amos Wilson, that's who I was trying to remember as well. I was fascinated with a lot of these Harlem